provisions that we want to get through just so that they can be considered for the people writing the bylaws.
Recording started.
Thank you. So, the first of these proposals has to do with the arbiter position. And this is probably our last day to be adding proposals for... This is probably our last day to be adding proposals for the first full draft of the bylaws that we are writing. So if you have any other proposals that haven't already been accounted for, and to see what has been accounted for, take a look at the screen that I'm currently sharing. Please add those to the committee meeting chat so that I can add them and make sure that they get covered. The first thing that we have to talk about today is the role of the arbiter. We've identified that there will be an arbiter on... Did we? Hold on. Yeah, we've identified that the arbiter is on the executive board. So the executive board does have an arbiter position. But I know there is at least some debate existing about whether the arbiter should remain the same as it currently is or should be changed, and a second debate regarding who exactly should be responsible for making any necessary changes. There is currently a motion to have the arbiter position effectively unchanged from the current bylaws, with the exception being the process for electing and removing the arbiter, which we will address later. The idea would be to have the current position be unchanged, with the understanding that amending that role is a job better lefted to a newly elected chapter. Did I say better lefted? That is a job better left to a newly elected chapter council. Does anyone second this motion that the role of arbiter should remain, for now at least, effectively unchanged, subject to chapter council rulings once a new system is implemented? Alternatively, okay, that motion is seconded. What thoughts do we have about, are there any necessary changes that we want to make to the arbiter as we're setting up these bylaws? Do we want to change the phrasing of this? This is obviously not phrased as a formal, or not necessarily phrased optimally as a formal proposal. Sai, go ahead.
Yeah, no, the arbiter position as a single individual to take on the role of decision-making process throughout Dagger here has been difficult at best. This is definitely one of those things where a council would have been better suited to fit, but when all this came about, we were in a point of need, so we needed to get a quick answer fast. Although a fast answer wasn't necessarily the best one. So I definitely think that we need to be reconsidering this process for something that would be more of a council position. That said, I think that should be left up to the chapter council, not to us.
Okay. So, core concept, the arbiter as it currently functions is not an optimal way to satisfy the need that we created the role for, but that's not our job to fix. Tyverus agrees. We have notes that the arbiter as a position needs more leeway with investigations. Stone agrees that it's not our job to fix. Reacher says best ideas he's come up with so far is have the arbiter be the chair of a small committee that makes decisions. Which does make sense. So how would we want to phrase or improve the phrasing of this proposal? Perhaps we could set a specific dates within which the arbiter position will be unchanged, and then after that the chapter council will have to Like, do we want the chapter council to have to go through the process of amending the bylaws to make necessary changes to the arbiter position? Or alternative, that's one option that I can think of. Go ahead.
All right, so the arbiter position should not be something that is easily changed. Much like the restrictions that we're putting onto the DBGA itself, it should be a position that is one that answers to the chapter council first, answers to the DBGA second. It needs to be semi-autonomous, but no matter what, we do need to make sure that we protect it from willy-nilly change. So yeah, I would agree that anytime that there's something to be changed within the arbiter structure, that it needs to go through the bylaws change process.
Okay. Then it sounds like the overarching sentiment is we should just say that the arbiter as a position stays effectively the same as it is now, and then we'll rely upon the upcoming chapter council to take it upon themselves to change that position and prioritize changing that position.
That makes sense. I stepped off the tractor for a second to talk from what I've seen working with Rune the last few days. Other than the needed leeway in making investigations, I think more effort needs to be put in pushing people to actually report things to the arbiter. That would be my other suggestion. If y'all can hear any of that.
Yes, we could hear that. Thank
Okay.
you. Or at least I could.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Stone just added the current bylaws, or the text of the current bylaws specifically concerning arbiter investigations to the chat for reference. Tivers, go ahead.
So I think that just needs like for to Reacher's point, there are individuals that I know of that their first go-to is always go to the authority, go to the arbiter, go to whoever. I do think that that is a cultural shift that will need to happen as well, because historically at some events, like if something goes wrong, and I'm not calling out anybody specifically, but like if somebody says, "Oh yeah, well we need to call the cops or something," or we need like someone official here, there's been some resistance in some events that I've been to historically. But I think that culture is changing. I think it is getting better, and I do know that some individuals are now getting better about, oh, well, if it's a big problem, take it to the arbiter. Like they'll just say that straight up. They're like, it's like quote unquote tap. They'll tap their sign, which just says take it to the arbiter. So I think that is getting improved. Excuse me, but I think that's stuff that's just with time and with trust in the process in order to make that stuff happen.
Yeah, in terms of encouraging reporting, I can't think of a way to incentivize to authentically incentivize victims to report without just making reporting a safe place where they, with a reasonable expectation of follow through. Sai, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I'm having a hard time typing. So right now, I think that it should be not so much an option, but a mandatory report for all chapters to report up anything that they end up deciding locally for internal disciplinary actions. So if we have a player who we've had to suspend from the chapter for bylaws breaks or code of conduct breaks, all this stuff needs to be sent up mandatorily to the arbiter so that it can be kept on record.
Okay. So one idea is chapter mandatory reporting of disciplinary actions. Tivers says, don't think it needs to be incentivized. I think building trust in the system and having the system be available should be incentive enough. Reacher agrees. Reacher also agrees with the mandatory reporting idea. Okay, so mandatory reporting is something that I think we could propose as a separate item today, but so far it seems like there is a general consensus to have the arbiter position be effectively unchanged from the current bylaws. And then the chapter council, we will just let them make bylaw amendments to change that position as it comes up. And then we can address chapter mandatory reporting as a separate item. Do you have a suggestion for what that text could, or how that text could be phrased?
No, I don't. I wish I did.
I can't.
I'm starting to come up with something.
Stone, you've got something you're working over there?
Yeah, give me 2 seconds.
Okay, thank you. Motion chapters. Okay. I'm gonna try reconnecting and see if that fixes it. Test 2, 3, is that better?
You've been coming through clear for me the entire time.
Stone's motion, chapters must report internal bans and discipline actions. Awesome, Cyril, thank you. Okay, that's good. Okay, so then we've got phrasing for the mandatory reporting section. Let me move all of this down.
Your stream has closed.
Oh, thank you. I will get that up in just a second. Okay, should be sharing now. Okay. So Stone's got a motion that's for the mandatory reporting section. I will add that for us to go into shortly. But text for the arbiter role. Okay, so size idea is to have just identify that all changes to the arbiter structure should fall solely within the purview of the chapter council.
I had a hand earlier.
Oh, sorry, I missed that. Go ahead.
This is actually to one of Reacher's conversation points earlier. There is nothing in the current bylaws that prevents an arbiter from appointing multiple assistants or other wording that they want to use. And those assistants, and then the arbiter could take the decisions of those assistants and rubber stamp their name to the eventual decision. So
Okay, so
if the arbiter wanted to create a consul out of the other couple of potential candidates we had who were qualified and were all complaining about the exact same thing, that would be an option.
Okay. Sirle?
Somewhere along that point, I'm in charge of, or I'm currently rewriting the chapter council structure and voting, and at least to offer up for approval in the bylaws, I'm breaking the chapter council down into regional heads, whereas chapter reps report the regional head, who reports to the chapter council head, who reports to the arbiter. So that can, if that is an idea that this group wants to enact, that kind of is already written into something I'm coming up with.
Thank you. Okay, so that covers amending the bylaws rule. That's mandatory reporting. Okay, so just for the sake of moving forward today, let's start with under consideration, the arbiter position shall remain effectively unchanged from and this is not like the text that will go into the new bylaws, but this will be used to inform the people currently writing our first draft of the new bylaws. So we don't need to get super in depth about the text of this motion. Starting with a motion, the arbiter position shall remain effectively unchanged. Are we ready to move forward and vote on that specific item and then move on to other stuff? Okay, unchanged arbiter is seconded. Any objection or phrasing suggestions? Okay. I don't see objections.
Size typing.
Size typing. Thank you. No objections. Okay. Okay. Stone, would you be able to add that to the motions chat? I don't have permissions. Or maybe, or Sai, sorry, Luda's not here today, so I need somebody to add the motion to the motions chat.
I'm typing it in now.
Thank you. So this isn't the text that's going to go into the bylaws. This is just us deciding how the bylaws writing is going to go. What I adapted that from was this here, motion to have the arbiter position effectively unchanged from the current bylaws, exception being the process for electing and removing the arbiter to be addressed later. With the understanding that amending the role of arbiter is a job better left to the newly elected chapter council, which is very long and has multiple different components. So starting with one component.
I put it into the motions and votes, if that's where you're intending.
Thank you. Okay. Chapter representatives, please do the thing. Runa, do you have a count of chapter reps here today so that I know when to wrap the vote?
I count 8, but I might be wrong.
Okay, thank you.
What channel do we put our vote in?
The committee motions and votes chat.
Gotcha.
Thank you. It should be the second one under the committee meeting. Header.
He's currently, Jareth, are you, one of the new chapter admins I was told to watch out for? I'm guessing?
I'm not sure. I've been here for a little while, just in and out.
Do you have authorization from your chapter to be the voting member of this body?
Yes.
Then I'll set you to the role, so you can actually vote.
There we go.
You should be able to vote now.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, that vote passes. Okay. What's today? The 1st? Okay. Next up. Somebody just stated that I think that since the arbiter is part of the executive board, it's already under the purview of the chapter council, so we don't need to explicitly vote on that. Do we agree? Like we've already assigned the chapter council the ability to adjust bylaws, and the only way to change the arbiter structure is to adjust the bylaws. So I think that's already accounted for.
I agree.
Okay. So that's already built into the system that's already built into the structures we've put in place. So I don't think that's fine. And then we've got a motion. Chapters must report internal bans and disciplinary actions. This report can choose if there is a desire of the chapter for the arbiter to investigate and potentially discipline at a national level.
Hand?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I just threw that in. I know that there is plenty of reasons for a local chapter to have social issues with a member that do not necessarily require national investigation or review. I figured that that would be an important thing to put in, but I'm not entirely sure how important it actually is for this vote here.
Okay. Sai, you have a hand?
All right, I do agree with Stone that there's a number of smaller issues that have no business making its way all the way up to the arbiter, at least not for action. However, it's important for Dagger here to know that there has been a history of activity with players. Otherwise, it's just a matter of having to continue to dig up information as they go through this whole investigative process. So there's nothing wrong with basically putting Dagger here on the CC line of an email whenever it goes out about, hey, this is an issue that we're dealing with. It's not asking for arbiter involvement as far as action, but it is making sure that the record is being pushed up the chain.
Okay, so is that a recommendation to strike the second sentence here? And just focus on the reporting. There should be some sort of notification sent to. I'm not sure which leadership body.
Go back to the stream. Hold on.
And well, currently,
okay, so the idea is that, okay, the arbiter will always have the option of making a decision to investigate and discipline at that level at any point in time. But the idea is that regardless of what's going on, the information needs to be made available. That's all I'm saying. So if we've got Johnny Whappy Bat down here who's just being an asshole, okay, that's an internal thing. We just have a record of him being an asshole. Being an asshole is not necessarily a bannable offense. It's just he's an asshole. So because there is an activity at the chapter level of hey, putting someone on a suspension for being an asshole, that could potentially in the future set information to be understood as kind of background information for any potential actions that would come later on. If Johnny just stays an asshole and that's it, well, then it doesn't go anywhere. It's not really a big deal.
So in this, so you're in the sorry, words. So here in that particular example, the mandatory would serve as a paper trail, providing context to potential later offenses.
Sure.
Okay, Tyverus?
I don't think we needed to make a distinction between social and like I mean, a social conflict versus disciplinary. If we have a mandatory reporting system that says, hey, Tyverus was banned because he swings too hard, then I go to a different park or whatever. If it's then relevant and goes at a national level, the arbiter can take that paper trail to make the decision on it and see whether or not it applies to a national ban or not.
Okay.
And if we have it as if part of the report, mandatory reporting says, do we want the arbiter involved, and check yes or no, then we can say, okay, yes, we want the arbiter involved. This is our initiating report. Or no, we just want this to be on the books so that if this does escalate and we don't hear about it, somebody else has this to work off of that we don't need on paper trail down later. That I don't think there needs to be a distinction as long as we just have it available for the reporter to say whether or not they want the arbiter involved.
Okay. Stone?
So this kind of has to do with the motion I was going to put in place in a second. That the current rules for arbiter is that a person may not be under any bans or suspensions. I was going to put in a motion that says a requirement for executive board position, which includes the arbiter, is that they may not be under any national bans or suspensions. And this is a big part of that. If a local ban occurs, that said ban does not necessarily invalidate them for position, but if, and part of why we need to have these reports forwarded, though, so that if there needs to be a national ban or suspension, it can be performed.
Okay. So that's something to come up later. Thank you. Okay. So sounds like, whoops. Well, I'll rewrite that in a moment. Sounds like we have most of a consensus. Yeah. Thank you for putting the text in, Stone. That's very helpful. So it sounds like we've got a consensus for the mandatory reporting. Do we have phrasing suggestions for this motion before we move it to a vote?
I do have a suggestion.
Yeah, go ahead.
Each chapter should have a council set up for reporting to the arbiter.
That's the leadership council.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. Sorry. I misunderstood.
Okay, so current phrasing here is chapters must report internal bans and discipline actions. This report can choose if there is a desire of the chapter for the arbiter to investigate and potentially discipline at a national level. Maybe may recommend here.
Yeah, may recommend, not choose. My biggest concern with that idea of choosing is that now we're trying to tell the arbiter what they can and cannot do with the information that they receive.
Tiberius, go ahead.
So that's, I think the like a counterpoint for having the mandatory reporting is if I don't expect that it should be. I guess the question that should be posed is it the arbiter's decision whether or not that the arbiter gets involved? In practice, not really, because somebody has to report it to the arbiter for the arbiter to be involved. If we're having mandatory reporting for a document trail, then that's we're basically saying that the arbiter would. How do I phrase this? If we're saying that you have to report every internal ban or disciplinary action to the arbiter, then we are now changing the definition of what is a report to the arbiter, because now it's more of a document trail than a request for assistance from the arbiter. And so that's why we need to have a note in there that says, hey, do we want your help or not? If we do, then it's a current report to the arbiter, because otherwise, like there's not a clear way to make the distinction. We just need to accept that we are already telling the arbiter what they should and shouldn't go, but currently it's just by reporting or not reporting. If we're removing that decision, we need to move that decision to the after the report has been made.
Okay. Okay, my understanding here was that this report wasn't a report to the arbiter necessarily for as a request for assistance, but rather just a report to the arbiter for the sake of arbiter records. And then that recommendation that the arbiter investigate constitutes the official like report of discipline to an arbiter. This is the thing you should deal with.
If I may, real quick,
Yeah.
that is also my current understanding, but that was also what Sai had just brought up, is that we are now telling the arbiter what they can and can't do based on the report, based on what they can investigate, based on what's reported to them.
Oh, I thought
And
he
so
was
that's what I was trying to
specifically
clarify.
referring to the. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
It's okay.
So I thought he was specifically referring to the chapter may choose that the arbiter investigate phrasing. But maybe
I was speaking specifically of that piece, but the concept stands. No, we do not tell the arbiter what they can and cannot do with the report that we provide them. However, we are providing them with we can suggest or we can recommend, hey, we believe that this should be investigated further, or we recommend that it be held under advisement, or however we want to say filed.
Okay. So are you satisfied with the way this is phrased now, or are there other suggestions for alteration?
Looks good to me. I would second that.
Okay. Tiberius?
If we're having mandatory reporting to the arbiter, and then leaving it up to the arbiter to decide which cases to get involved with and which not to get involved with, then I am no longer for the mandatory reporting. The arbiter position should be there for, we want you, like if we're reporting something to the arbiter and they're going to make that distinction on each individual report, then we've now diluted the value of taking something to the arbiter. If we're able to take something from a chapter and they send it to the arbiter and they just want to say, hey, we want this part of the document trail, and they can make that distinction on whether or not they want the arbiter involvement, then I can accept that mandatory reporting could be useful for that document trail. But if it's like, oh, you're going to take it there and then they can make that distinction on their own, then all of a sudden it's the arbiter's going to get so many more reports based on individual parks that on the whole they're not really going to need to even see, except for like going through for historical records.
Okay, Sai?
Yeah, I get what you're saying there, Tiberius. The problem comes in that we need to make sure that things are getting reported. We want to get more reporting, not less. We want to encourage more activity, not less. And we're not telling the arbiter what they can or can't do with it. We're simply saying Park A thinks that this is it's a problem, but we think it's a local problem that we believe we're handling on our own. Just because Park A says that doesn't mean that the arbiter is going to agree with it, and the arbiter has free reign to do as they please with the reporting they receive.
Okay, Stone?
I was actually going to follow. Yeah, I agree with Sai. If Park A decides that Tiberius is a Reinhardt hits too hard, and it does not like him to be around anymore, that's their decision. That might not necessarily be something that we want to ban a person, Tiberius, from Dagger here for. If Tiberius has already been banned from multiple parks for that exact same reason, maybe there's a reason. Maybe the arbiter can draw the connection at that point. Sorry, Tiberius, I'm just using you because I'm looking at your name.
I've definitely done that in class before. Okay. Any other comments or phrasing suggestions before we decide to vote? Okay, are we ready to bring this to a vote? Is the current phrasing seconded? This motion is seconded. I'm going to add it to the drafts for reference. I think recommend is supposed to have 1C, so that's a typo. Any objection to moving this to a vote? And I also missed C. Okay. Stone, would you mind moving that to the vote chat, please? Okay, it is in the chat. Chapter representatives.
I think we're at 9 now instead of 8.
We're at 9. Okay, thank you. Okay, that is 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This motion passes. Thank you all. That was some very good discussion. Okay. Okay, done with that. Okay. So what have we got left? We've got executive board positions not being under national discipline. We've got executive director clarifies executive board department / interprets bylaws. We've got regionalization of the chapter council. We've got the role of shadow. Let's go with this one, since I know Cyril mentioned that was something you were dealing with. And then we'll get to the executive board positions with national bans and suspensions. Any objection to that order? Okay. We have a motion to regionalize the chapter council for coordination. Chapter council would split Dagger membership into geographic regions, northeast, southeast, etc. Chapter council members would annually elect regional chairs whose duties include recording and reporting on active chapters to the chapter council chairman. chapter council regional chairs would work closely with the event chairs and chapter council reps in their region to track activity and thus chapter active status. So this wouldn't affect the proposed duties of the executive board. This would be effectively for more efficient function of the chapter council as a body. Does anyone second this idea? Brigadon?
So just so I understand this correctly, this situation basically would be between all of the chapters everywhere being on a single council versus chapters being split into their regional areas, so smaller councils, but those councils would then have a chair that would represent their regions for larger decisions and stuff like that. Am I understanding this correctly?
I think this isn't meant to change how the full chapter council meetings go. Like the chapter council as it was originally conceived still meets. Just that in between major chapter council meetings, there exist regional coordinators to coordinate which chapters are having events and which chapters are being active and stuff like that. So the full chapter council meetings as like a quasi-legislative body still function exactly that way. So the specifics of how the chapter council gets regionalized, I think, aren't necessarily the biggest priority. But do we all think that regionalizing the chapter council in between major meetings in general is a useful thing to do? Stone?
So I'm looking at this writing here, and this regional chairs would be responsible for tracking activity and chapter status. Isn't that kind of a position of the executive board's secretary or whatever we're calling that, records director?
Let's see, what's our executive board composition? Operations?
Or
Probably.
either operations or records?
Or records, yeah.
Yeah,
That's a point.
If I could hop in here.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that was my thought. That is the point of the director of records. Yes, this was to help break that, pretty much help in that regard, because obviously we are all volunteers. Yes, we're asking people who are taking over these positions to make this their priority. This move, I feel, would help break that duty down so that it's a bit more manageable for one person.
Hand.
Yep, go ahead, Stone.
So couldn't this be a, what was the word we used, a board or a working group created by the executive council to help in managing those positions?
This is essentially making that board, because I only have the country broken down into like 5 regions thus far. So that would already just be a board of 5 extra people to help manage these records.
So are you suggesting that the executive board must have this helpful board to help it? Or are you suggesting that that would be one of the first things that the executive board would do, is create this regional chairmanship to help it?
It's not necessarily part of the executive board. This is all of the people who are the regional heads are also their active chapter rep. They're the representative for their chapter. So this is it's essentially a function of the chapter council, but obviously the director of records works with the chapter council to keep these things updated.
To answer a couple questions for Olaf, I think the region reps here are elected by the chapter council reps for each region. Like they choose one among themselves to serve as the regional chair.
Correct.
So sort of like a senator house subcommittee might get elected from a group of senators or representatives or something. And then do we have enough workload? I know from talking with one of the previous secretaries that one of the major challenges of that position is keeping track of which chapters are still active and managing paperwork. There is actually a surprising amount of workload that goes into managing all of that stuff.
The further thought for that is that by having regional heads instead of one person overseeing the entire nation, the regional heads are more in tune with what the activity is like in their area, I feel. And that would help them be more accurate in their reporting.
Tiberius?
I'm not feeling sold on this. Because we're like I understand there is a lot of workload with it, but I think that is something that if someone is the director of records, they could appoint someone that, hey, I need help with paperwork for this area. I don't know that we have enough. In all honesty, and one of my biggest like hesitancies in the bylaws setup is getting enough volunteers in general. Adding 5 more positions on top of, or 4 more positions on top of the executive board. Like I feel like that point enough is going to be difficult to fill. That if we add this as responsibilities for chapter reps, then there might be a little bit of an easier sell. Like you're a chapter rep who is then elected as part of this council, but I'm still not really sold on it. It does not. But I also don't know the background enough. That's why I was asking about if there's enough workload for it, because there's my hesitancy mostly is getting enough people to fill the seats that we're already making to add into 5 more.
My understanding is that this would just effectively be a somewhat larger amount of workload for people that are already chapter representatives. So some chapter representatives would just be like decide among themselves to be the touchstone for the director of operations or records for their local area or region. So we're not asking for like a completely separate volunteer. We're just identifying who among the chapter representatives we should talk to for stuff in the Northeast, for example. But at least that is my understanding. And Tiberius, you mentioned that if the director of records or operations or whomever found that they had enough work that they needed to help somebody, they could just call somebody to volunteer for it. But I think that your point about having trouble finding volunteers would be a problem with that sort of approach where people just look for volunteers whenever they need them. I think that if we're worried about finding volunteers, it would be better to formalize this process as something that a few of the chapter reps like are the appointed touchstones for the executive board rather than leaving it up in the air.
We could also give the interpretation of bylaws to this chapter chair group.
I think the chapter council, just as a whole, gets that power, not necessarily just the regional heads.
I was more putting it out in the past year with COVID and the other situations that have gone on. We've tried to rely on the board of directors kind of taking votes for anything that's. We have no rules for this. Try to follow the spirit of the rules. So this would be the group that could help us follow the spirit of the rules for we need decisions made in quick succession faster than we could call a chapter council meeting. That was my intention.
Okay. Well, the matter of who interprets the bylaws in emergencies is definitely an important topic. Everest?
So if we are having, trying to figure out how to. So if we're having the individual chapters take more of a administrative approach in being part of the chapter council and being part of tracking and being part of documentation, shouldn't they? I would expect, hopefully, that would help lighten the load somewhat, because now the chapter reps are going to be, or the chapter council is going to be handling a lot more of that documentation already. Do we need, like, I'm still not sold on the needing to split it into geographical regions, because each park, I mean, obviously for new parks or things on that line that they need to go to, say, the director of records or the chapter council in general. But for majority of the rest of the paperwork, the individual chapters should already be that point of contact. And depending on how you set up the lines, they would be kind of an arbitrary regions on who's part of which region. I mean, I'm technically part of in Roswell, New Mexico, but sometimes it feels like you're more part of Texas, even though the state line divides both of it, just because we do more work through there. That's kind of just my 2 cents, though.
Okay.
Yeah.
The current regions that I had split up thus far was mostly based on time zones, so that if there are meetings between the different regions, they would have a common ground with scheduling.
Olaf, that is something to consider. I think the original concept was that finding volunteers to create the committees ad hoc could be difficult. And so formalizing it would be a useful way to enable the records director to do their job effectively. But that is a point.
Hand.
Stone?
Could I suggest maybe you have the line CC members would annually whose duties would include recording and reporting on active chapters to the CC chairman. Change that from CC chairman to executive board to make this more specific that this is a body that is supposed to be helping the executive board with its job.
So then, essentially the regional chairs are the go-between between the chapter council and the executive board for various duties and responsibilities. And I guess we really don't need a chapter council head except for head of chapter council meetings.
No, I'm more thinking like who would they report to in the chapter council? I mean, the chapter council doesn't actually have a specific position that would then record and react to activity. That's the current role of the executive body.
That is true, yes. That was my main thought is these regional heads. Well, originally the regional heads would be reporting to the head of the whole chapter council, but I do believe you're right, or whether or not this is what you were proposing, but the idea that we essentially don't need that chapter council head as a second go-between. They would just go between from the chapter council to the executive board. If that's what you're saying, I think.
That was what I was implying. I'm just wondering if there's ways I can make this more useful. I'm not fully in agreement with it yet.
Reacher, I don't remember there being an official go-between between the chapter council and the executive board. Do you remember which position that was?
I was more meaning that we already made that one can override comment. So I'm asking what else. It's already go between guys who exist and they were set up. You know, one has to answer for certain things, like that's how it was set up.
I'm sorry, I couldn't parse that. Tyverus says instead of going to the regional head, why not go to the specific chapter in question? The chapters go to the region head, who then goes to the executive. Seems like a lot more steps for miscommunication. I would also be interested to know the expectations of the regional heads. Are they entering the data into the system for the executive or just gathering it?
I have a feeling we could solve some of these issues with reporting via technology.
Olaf says if we need more people to do the job, have the executive record keeper mandatory appoint 3 others for their staff. The verse says, so I send my data to Stone, for example, who then forwards it and others to the executive. Why not just send it to the executive? Stone could see value in having a small number of chapter council members who are pre-volunteered for extra work. General consensus seems to not be in favor of regions, which is fine. Could always be added in later if the director of efforts find their process or committee isn't working. Okay. So shall we table this for now then?
Is there a desire to bring it to a vote?
Or would we like to bring this to a vote? Okay. Okay, so we're going to withdraw that. Stone proposed that we require executive board candidates to not be under active national ban or suspension.
Hand.
Stone, go ahead.
This goes along with that required reporting, in that the current arbiter rule requires that an arbiter candidate not be under a ban or suspension and does not have that word national in it. If the ban is local but not national, I could see it being an issue, and I am all up for having a debate about this.
So go ahead.
All right, so we've just established that we definitely need to have chapters do mandatory reporting to the arbiter for their activities, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so assuming that you have a local suspension or ban, that would need to be mandatorily reported up to the national arbiter for at least review, or records keeping. If it's a ban, though, I would think that the arbiter would immediately take it into consideration for a potential national ban.
I suspect that arbiters would, but if the chapter didn't recommend that happen, it wouldn't be required of the arbiter. But likely that is something the arbiter would consider.
Right, because regardless of what the chapter recommends, it's just a recommendation. It's not an order, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so if we have this position where a person is under a ban from a local chapter for X, Y, or Z reason, and it goes up to the arbiter, now the arbiter has the opportunity to review it. I tend to believe that at this point, if you have a ban that gets sent up to the arbiter and now they're under investigation per a chapter's decision, that should at least keep them from being eligible for running until that investigation is complete.
So you're suggesting add the word investigation in there?
No, I think that it is best I understand it, where as long as they're not under ban, or not under ban or not research, investigation. I don't really like that. Inquiry by the arbiter.
Mm-hmm.
We got to find a word for that.
Yeah. So I think the one reason for saying specifying under national ban rather than local is to avoid the option for local groups acting in bad faith to ban candidates that they are not in favor of. That is at least one
Well, that's a
possible
fair.
pro of this structure. Also, I'm not sure whether the arbiter is allowed to or required to report on who is under investigation. Or what restrictions or requirements there are for the arbiter to report who is being investigated / not report who's being investigated. Tyrus?
I think the confusion is that, and correct if I'm wrong, sorry, but I believe what he's saying is that if a chapter reports something to the arbiter, even if they don't request arbiter action, that should still be considered a under national review, basically, or like still prevent them from running for office, which I don't know that I necessarily agree or disagree with it, but I believe that that's where the confusion is that if a chapter, say, reports an individual, that was grounds for not being eligible for office, just by the purview that it is expected that the arbiter still has to review it. But I could be wrong on that point.
So we're talking about potential abuse because of local chapter acting in bad faith sends up Johnny Wappy Bats as being a bad guy. So now they say that, okay, we've banned Johnny Wappy Bats. It's got to go up to the arbiter. The arbiter is going to say, hey, this is a local ban. We need to investigate this. So the arbiter goes and starts reviewing it. As long as there's a prohibition on eligibility due to review, then that could be an issue for diddling of elections. That's what you're saying?
Correct. I'm not sure if that was the original intent of writing the national ban in when Stone wrote this in the first place, but I can envision that being a potential abuse of prohibiting people under local ban from running or national review. Sty, go ahead.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
Sorry.
Can we establish that that a standing arbiter review does not stop regardless of electoral activities?
Was that a request that we added, or was that a question? Sorry, I didn't process.
Well, so the idea being, let's say that we don't say anything but other than national ban or suspension. We changed the terminology to say that. That means that the review process, the investigation, whatever term we want to use for what happens whenever a local chapter suspension or ban goes up to the national level and gets handed to the arbiter. Is there any way that we could say that just because an individual is being investigated by the arbiter, that just because that same individual's up for election and they happen to also be
My
under
computer's in there, but
arbiter.
it's still dark and silent, so you don't have to worry about anything.
I'm sorry?
I think she was unmuted accidentally. Go ahead.
Okay. So candidate A is being reviewed due to a local ban, right? Election goes through. Let's say candidate A wins because 90% of Dagger doesn't know who they are, is in the negative stuff, because it never made it up to the arbiter. It never finished the arbiter process. The arbiter process has got to still be able to continue on throughout the electoral activity, and it's got to be able to remain impartial. That way, even if this person does get elected, then they have to be booted from office immediately thereafter upon findings. I mean, is that still something that we envision to be protected?
That is definitely something we can propose.
because I just don't want there to be a situation where, oh, well, they won, so, we're just going to go ahead and stop the inquiry. I like the idea of these being kind of like an attorney general activity, where the person in question is under inquiry regardless of what's going on around them.
So we can definitely put forward and vote on arbiter investigations can still apply and continue when focusing on elected officials or elected official candidates. Is that what you're looking for?
Sounds good to me.
Cool. For this matter, for the candidate requirement that they not be under national ban, though, are there any further modifications you want to make to this? We have about 20 minutes left today. Would you rather not delete the word active, you mean?
I would disagree with that because because there are some bans that could have expired.
Or were you just reiterating the current phrasing? Okay, just reiterating. Okay, cool. Any objection to moving this to vote? Executive board candidates may not be under active national ban or suspension. Seconded, voting is seconded. Any objection to moving this to vote? I don't see any objection. Okay, I copied that into the drafts. Okay, I count 8. Are we missing one?
Reacher stepped away, so 8's all we have for right now.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So that passes. Okay, and then I think a better phrasing was what somebody just added to the chat here for this next item. Executive board members and candidates are not protected from arbiter investigation or decisions.
And
Go ahead.
pointing out that the current arbiter ruling the bylaws connected to a conflict of interest requires that the arbiter to appoint a neutral third party to investigate and make a decision when there is a conflict of interest. I could see if there's an investigation of an active board, that being a potential conflict of interest. But not necessarily. Just pointing out that that is already there, that there is a provision for conflicts of interests already exist.
Okay. I think we can just If anyone disagrees, feel free to go ahead. But I think we can just continue with this phrasing and just make sure we maintain that ethics clause in the new bylaws. Because that would still apply to this sort of situation. Is this motion seconded? The executive board members and candidates are not protected from arbiter investigations or decisions. That is seconded. Other suggestions for modification? Or questions or comments?
I can comment that while this isn't in the current bylaws, it's always kind of been implied. Just for the record.
That is true. Good point. Do we think this is worth making explicit? Okay. It seems like we have a consensus. I don't see any other suggestions for modification, so are we ready to move this to a vote? Voting is seconded. Whoops, that's a typo. Hold on. That's better. Okay, that's in the drafts chat.
Posted.
Okay, thank you. Chapter rips. One, two, eight, that is 8. That passes.
I believe we're back up to 9.
Oh, we are back up to 9. Excellent. Who are we missing then? Oh, there we go. Okay. We have about 10 more minutes. We could talk about shadow for this last section, or we could talk about bylaw interpretation. Does anyone have a strong preference about which of those topics we addressed? Okay, let's do clarification of bylaws. A pre-existing proposal was that the executive director should provide clarification for the responsibilities of each department / interpreting the bylaws as our fix for who interprets the bylaws in short notice situations, i.e. emergency type stuff / COVID response type things. Is that seconded? Do we have alternative suggestions? Executive director. Was that specifically for, these are slightly different. This one's just clarifying responsibilities and this one's clarifying responsibilities and interpreting bylaws. Were you responding to the interpretation part as well? Okay. Excellent. So we're addressing this specific phrasing here currently. This has been seconded. Let's talk about it. What thoughts do we have? Do we have any suggestions for modification? Any objections, questions, comments? Whoever says let the executive director direct. If the chapter council thinks meaning the bylaws, I think should be different, let them debate and vote on the changes to the bylaws. Stone agrees. So the current phrasing implies that the executive director's responsibility to interpret the bylaws is specifically limited to providing clarification for department roles. Do we want to maintain that implication? Or say and here instead? You like keeping it? You second keeping it? Okay. Okay. Any suggestions for phrasing changes before we bring this to a vote? Voting is seconded. Any objection? Let me check for typos. Okay, don't see any objections. That's in the draft chat. Thank you for your patience as we get it to the voting chat.
Oh, chat. Oops.
Okay, there we go. Chapter reps. I count 9, that passes. Okay, that is, I think, all we had on the table today. Are there any other? And I don't think today we have time to get into discussion of shadows before we wrap at 8:30. Are there any other proposals that anyone wants to put forward today? Stone?
Yeah, so I wanted to bring the general question of who runs / maintains / officiates elections and how we should be doing that. Is that the responsibility of the executive body to make sure that all that is communicated well, or is that the responsibility of the chapter council head, or who else?
That is a good and important question.
And examples of that is advertising to the board, the community via social media, vetting people via background checks, all of that work.
Okay, I see 2 motions to discuss that next Sunday on the 8th. Any objection to, that's a really important thing, and I think that's going to take time to discuss. So any objection to moving that to Sunday, the 8th of August? So for next time, we've got the running of elections, we've got shadow. Whoops, not mean to delete that. Okay. Any other topics? Next time, currently, the only things I think are on the table for next time are the running of elections, the role of shadow, if we want to include it, and what exactly that entails, and then presenting our draft of the bylaws for review. Any other suggestions? Obviously, these are things that that would then get added to the draft of the bylaws after next week. But we are approaching it is now August, and we need to have a finished product by the end of August. So we are in the final stretch. Any other proposals for us to debate next week before we wrap for the day? I don't see anything. If you do have a proposal, please email it to daggerhere.bylaws@gmail.com for us to add to the list of things under consideration. Thank you all for joining us today. We've had a lot of really good discussion. I look forward to seeing you all next week.
Recording
Have a good
ending.
night, guys.